I think anyone who's had an authentic taste of Orthodox spirituality, whether that's in the local parish or at a monastery, an Orthodox monastery, and who has a Roman Catholic background, will come to the conclusion quite readily, and possibly many Protestants as well. In fact, definitely, especially Anglicans, but others too, because I see Methodist converts, Baptist converts, of course, will come to the conclusion that a true revival and renewal of the Western Church will necessarily entail a return to the ancient tradition of the universal church, a true Catholicity beyond a oversimplification of the medieval era and of the age of St. Thomas Aquinas and all the rest of it, of hard scholasticism and hyper rationalism, etc. It will require a return to the Greek patristics, to the Greek fathers. It will require a renewal, an opening of the door to Holy Orthodoxy, to the divine liturgy, to the Orthodox monastic spirituality, to hesychasm, to the ancient asceticism of the Orthodox Church, and thus a deep recovery of its ancient Celtic its ancient roots in the West for 1,000 years. Now, Père Placide Deseille was a convert to Orthodoxy. He'd been a Benedictine monk and writer, friend of Jean Danilou, Henri de Lubac, and other movers and shakers in the Catholic Church that were seeking this return to deep patristics, to the ancient faith, beyond a mere caricature of medieval scholasticism, as it were, hyper clarity, but we're seeking to read between the lines and get beyond Augustine eclipsing everything that had gone before and everything that had come after. You know, giving Augustine his place, but not necessarily rolling with the narrative that he was the greatest of all church fathers and really he'd said it all. Père Placide de Sales has a YouTube documentary, just him talking for 45 minutes without notes, from what I can see, just showing how East and West are so combined and interlinked for 1,000 years of their history, and how this didn't break with the schism, how even after the schism, the East continued to influence the West, and of course, vice versa. So the first thing is to state that I'm just going to go through what he says because it's in French, and I don't want to translate the whole thing, but I do want to make a comment on this documentary. So I think going clockwise around this mind map, the first thing he acknowledges is the 1,000 years of communion between East and West, indisputable, and that regardless of anyone who wasn't in abject heresy of Arianism or some other clear error was in communion with the Orthodox Church. There was a rich patristic tradition, therefore, in the West, and he cites, for example, the writings of St. Ambrose of Milan, St. John Cassian, which I know influence today Orthodox scholars and monastics. When I visit Orthodox monasteries, they cite them, they quote them, their books are on sale. The thing with St. John Cassian is, I think he was from Romania, but he'd gone off to Egypt, he'd gone off to Palestine, to the Nitrea and the other great skeet at the Desert Fathers. He writes about his travels. He interviews the desert monks and comes up with his conferences and then the institutes, which serve as a kind of early rule. He brings all of this back to the West and sets up monasteries in Paris and in France. And, you know, following on from him will be Saint Benedict with his rule, which massively influences all of the Roman Catholic orders, even up to this day. And then you've got, as an offshoot of that, St. Bruno with more of a return to the anachoretic, to the hermit life, as opposed to the purely cenobitic. Although it sought, like St. Pachomius before him, to combine the two. And then you've got, obviously, the Carthusian saints, the Camaldolese hermits, and their links with the Greek fathers. It's not that, wow, these guys just read Augustine all day and quote Thomas Aquinas. No, they have deep roots in Greek patristics. And this is something that's the church in the West is happily awakening to more and more, as Placide Deseille is going to say in this 45-minute teaching of his. Now, he does acknowledge that there was fault lines early on in the Western Church in two major ways. There was fault lines of diversion, of schism, if you like, of innovation. And this was in ecclesiological terms. The church in the West started to see itself as, well, the Pope as the boss man for the whole church, as opposed to a primacy of respect, rather of leadership and calling the shots for the entire church. And also you have the idea of the filioque being introduced by the Carolingians, by Charlemagne and his successors in their quest to build a new Western empire with kind of set apart from the waning Greek empire, which was beset by Turkish invasions and whatnot. I'm not a historian, so forgive me if I'm carving that up, but these are all fascinating areas for your own research. The West saw these things as developments of dogma, which is perfectly licit. This was given the title and explained by Cardinal John Henry Newman, a convert from Anglicanism. But in the East, it was just simply looked on, whether the Copts or the Greeks, the Antiochians just looked on and said, no, this is just heresy. This is just innovation. It's not orthodox. We can't embrace it. We then have in his talk the influences of the East post-schism. So even after the schism, the great Eastern heritage, the great patristics, the great church fathers continued to influence the West. How could they not? And one can see this all over Western spiritual writing. He quotes, for example, the example of the Franciscans, this return to a biblical radicality of poverty, chastity, and obedience, of this kind of the fool for Christ and whatnot. But then he talks about the spiritual Franciscans, who were an offshoot of the Franciscans, who an early offshoot, who basically were not happy with the sheer corruption and power of the church in the West, particularly in Rome, of the popes, and had been obviously then rejected and persecuted. And they'd escaped to Greek monasteries, and there they'd imbibed St. John Climacus, the Hesychastic Fathers, and all of that good stuff, and eventually brought it back to the West, to their home lands, and been largely rejected by the then hyper-Augustinian environment. I mean, even St. John Cassian was not deemed a saint in the West, because in a couple of chapters of the conferences, he dares to offer an alternative narrative to Augustine's view of grace, which was, and Père Placide Deseille touches on this tangentially, that in the West we have this hyper-Augustinianism, which will lead to errors which basically deny human free will and the powerful role of free will, and leads to this Calvinism, hyper Calvinism, on one hand, Lutheranism, on the other, areas which reject the cooperation of humanity and of the human soul in opening themselves to God. God doesn't force himself on anyone, even on the elect. And there's a mystery. So that's exactly what it is, a mystery. It's interesting, actually, that he mentions St. John Cassian, case in point, that his writings influenced St. John Climacus in the East. St. John Climacus, that's still a kind of the go-to, almost the Thomas Aquinas of Eastern monasticism to this day. His book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, is like a manual which is read and celebrated every Lent, every Holy Lent in Orthodoxy. Well, many of his ideas, according to Père Placide Deseille, come from St. John Cassian. So it's not just the East enriching the West, of course, but vice versa. You've got the patristic renewal in the West. He talks about this. There's been a lot of writing, gathering up the church fathers into patristic collections like Lamine and others, into Latin, principally the Greek fathers into Latin, but also into the vernacular languages, English, French, Italian, Spanish. And these collections, we had them in seminary and are used and read and loved by Roman Catholic parish priests, by seminaries, by seminarians, by students of Western theology, and it can only be a good thing. A return to the great patristic heritage of the first 1,000 years, which isn't just Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, but is much richer and more diverse than this. It's interesting, actually, that the author says that in the early days of the church in the West, what happens is the clerics couldn't speak Greek or didn't want to speak Greek. There was whatever it was, and they spoke Latin. And the Latin of Ambrose of Milan, which was very orthodox and very in line with the patristic fathers, and it was a high Latin, unfortunately, and they couldn't fully access it. Augustine was much easier to read. This is what he, Placide Deseille, asserts. And therefore, and because he was such a prolific writer, Augustine, such a warm writer, such a psychological writer, and he loved to innovate, yes, to elucubrate, to philosophize. I mean, the guy had been a professional orator before he came, and a pagan philosopher, a Manichaean before he came to Christ. And one sees that influence. The patristic revival of the post-Vatican II era with Jean Danilou, Henri de Lubac, Placide Deseille accompanied them, was a friend of theirs. He worked alongside them in writing books about the ancient Greek fathers and the great patristic tradition, getting beyond mere kind of like, what would we say, rigor mortised scholasticism, which had been present from the late medieval times in the Western Church, getting beyond, obviously, just, bibliolatry in the Protestant circles as well, to discover the cosmopolitan, five-spoked wheel of the ecumenical Orthodox Church with the five patriarchates, not just Rome. And we're not, the West is either Roman or it's in rebellion to Rome. But it's this Roman paradigm. It's this like seeing Rome at the center of the spoke, when actually the church is far bigger than that, far richer and far deeper. And I have many Protestant friends. I know that they would, and returning to Orthodoxy now, it's like I have to lose connection with them, because as far as they're concerned, I've returned to some form of Catholicism that they don't understand, that they're not willing to understand, and they don't want to know about. They see an altar and they say, no, it's like Rome. They see a priest and they say, no, vestments, evil. They see pictures, idolatry. Get me back to a Bible study or I'm going to collapse. Absolutely no disrespect meant, but that's what we face. That's what we face. Scholars then like Père Placide Deseille offer us a historical, rational, but deeply spiritual invitation to the more ancient and deeper and richer universal, therefore truly Catholic Church. What has always been believed, as St. Vincent de Laurent said in the 5th century, what has always been believed by all, everywhere, that is what we hold to.